According to legend, she rode twice the distance of Paul Revere through a storm at just 16. Her 40-mile journey through the treacherous darkness is said to have helped hundreds of soldiers and shaped a key battle's response. Yet she was rewarded not with fame or glory, but with a lifetime of obscurity, a rejected pension, and an unmarked grave. Her name was Sybil Ludington. Why was a nation so quick to forget the name of the girl who rode to save it? To understand the magnitude of Sybil Ludington's alleged ride, we must first understand her world. In 1777, America was in turmoil, the Revolution entering its second brutal year. The Declaration of Independence had been signed the year before, a defiant proclamation of sovereignty that had turned protesters into traitors in the eyes of the British Empire. But words on parchment were one thing, winning independence on the battlefield was another entirely. The Continental Army, under the command of General George Washington, was a ragtag force, often chronically short of supplies, food, and even shoes. They faced the most professional army in the world, the British Redcoats, supported by formidable Hessian mercenaries. In early 1777, Patriot morale was precarious. The British had captured New York City, a strategic nerve center, and turned it into their base of operations. Washington had just pulled off stunning victories at Trenton and Princeton, small glimmers of hope in a dark winter, but the overall picture remained grim. The British strategy for 1777 was ambitious: divide and conquer. Their plan, conceived largely by General John Burgoyne, was a grand pincer movement. Burgoyne would lead a large army south from Canada, along Lake Champlain and the Hudson River. A second, smaller force would push east from Lake Ontario, and General William Howe, the British commander-in-chief, was expected to lead his main army north up the Hudson from New York City. The goal was for all three to converge on Albany, thereby severing New England, the cradle of the rebellion, from the rest of the colonies. If successful, this plan could have choked the life out of the Revolution. It was against this backdrop of grand strategy that smaller, local actions played out, each with the potential to tip the scales. The war was not fought only on large battlefields with massed armies. It was a war of raids, ambushes, and guerrilla tactics. It was fought in small towns, on country roads, and in the hearts of divided communities. And nowhere were communities more divided than in New York. Unlike Massachusetts, where patriot sentiment was overwhelming, New York was a battleground of loyalties. It had arguably the largest population of loyalists, colonists who remained faithful to King George III, of any of the 13 colonies. Families were torn apart, neighbor turned against neighbor. An air of suspicion and fear was pervasive. In some areas, particularly in southern New York, law and order had completely broken down. The region where the Ludington family lived, then the southern part of Dutchess County, what is today Putnam County, sat in a perilous zone known as the neutral ground. It was a desolate, ungoverned stretch of land between the British positions to the south and American forces to the north. It was anything but neutral. It was a land of chaos, terrorized by roving bands of marauders. There were the cowboys, often loyalists, who specialized in rustling cattle and supplies to sell to the British Army. And there were the skinners, who claimed allegiance to the Patriot cause but were often little more than bandits using the war as a cover for their own enrichment. For the people who lived here, the threat of a raiding party was as real as the threat of an advancing army. This was the world Sybil Ludington grew up in, a world where survival required vigilance, resilience, and an intimate knowledge of the land. In this climate of instability, the local militia system was the first line of defense. Unlike the professional Continental Army, the militia was composed of ordinary citizens, farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, who took up arms when their homes were threatened. They were part-time soldiers, often lacking the discipline and training of their British counterparts, but they had one crucial advantage. They were fighting to protect their own homes and families. Mobilizing these militia units quickly was absolutely vital, and that required an effective system of communication, a network of riders who could carry the alarm across the sprawling countryside. Sybil's own father, Colonel Henry Ludington, was a key figure in this network. He was the commander of the 7th Regiment of the Dutchess County Militia. It was his responsibility to rally his citizen soldiers at the first word of enemy activity. His home, located in the area then known as Fredericksburg, was essentially a local military headquarters. Dispatches came and went, carrying intelligence and orders. The life of the Ludington family was inextricably linked to the pulse of the war. For young Sybil, the eldest of what would eventually be 12 children, discussions of strategy, whispers of troop movements, and the constant underlying tension of the war were part of her daily existence. She was not an outsider looking in on history. She was living at its very center. Another critical piece of this context is the importance of supply depots. Wars cannot be fought without guns, gunpowder, uniforms, food, and medicine. Both sides sought to disrupt the other's supply chain. By the spring of 1777, the Patriots had established a crucial supply depot in Danbury, Connecticut, just over the New York border. Danbury was a logistical hub filled with the material needed to keep the Continental Army in the field. To the British, garrisoned in New York, this depot was a tempting target. Its destruction would be a major blow to the American war effort, crippling Washington's ability to fight and sowing panic throughout the region. The British chose their man for the job well, William Tryon, the former royal governor of both New York and North Carolina. Tryon was ruthless and effective, known for his hardline tactics. He had no illusions about winning hearts and minds. He believed in crushing the rebellion with overwhelming force. In late April 1777, Tryon assembled a force of nearly 2,000 British regulars and loyalists. They boarded transport ships and sailed east along the Long Island Sound, bound for the Connecticut coast. Their target? Danbury. Their plan: land, make a lightning-fast march inland, burn the depot, and withdraw before American militia forces could effectively assemble. This, then, was the stage that was set on the night of April 26, 1777. A crack British invasion force was driving deep into Patriot territory. A vital supply depot was in imminent danger, and a scattered network of militia, including the men under Colonel Henry Ludington's command, was the only hope of mounting a defense. All that was missing was the spark to light the fuse, a messenger, an alarm, someone willing to ride into the perilous night to sound the warning. Sybil Ludington's world was one of contrasts. It was the pastoral beauty of the New York countryside, the rolling hills, the dense forests, the small farmsteads, set against the brutality of a civil war. It was the tight-knit bonds of community and family, being torn asunder by political allegiances. It was an era where a woman's role was largely confined to the domestic sphere, yet circumstances sometimes thrust women into the very center of great historical events. Imagine the daily life of a 16-year-old girl in this time. Sybil would have risen at dawn. Her responsibilities as the eldest child would have been immense. She would have helped her mother, Abigail, manage the large brood of younger siblings. She would have participated in the never-ending chores of an 18th century household, cooking over an open hearth, tending the garden, spinning and weaving cloth, making candles, milking cows. Formal education was limited, especially for girls, but she would have been educated in the practical skills needed to run a household and survive in a challenging world. But her life was not merely domestic. Growing up in a semi-wild territory, she would have certainly been an accomplished rider. A horse was not a luxury. It was an essential mode of transportation. She would have known the local trails and shortcuts like the back of her hand. She would have known where her neighbors lived, who could be trusted, and who was suspect. This knowledge, this deep familiarity with the land and its people would prove to be invaluable. And always, there was the war lurking in the background. The sound of hooves on the road could be a neighbor, or it could be a dispatch rider carrying life or death news. A strange fire on a distant hillside could be a signal, or it could be a loyalist's home being torched. Uncertainty was a constant companion. Fear was a familiar emotion. But with fear came resilience. People like the Ludingtons were not passive victims of history. They were active participants, making daily choices that would shape their future and that of their fledgling nation. They had chosen a side, and that choice came with enormous risks. The home of Colonel Ludington, a prominent Patriot leader, would have been a prime target for Loyalists and British troops. Every member of his family lived under the shadow of that threat. So when an exhausted, mud-spattered messenger arrived at the Ludington doorstep on that fateful night carrying the terrible news that the British were burning Danbury, it was not an abstract event. It was happening next door. The fires of Danbury, only 20 or so miles away, would have cast a faint, ominous glow against the eastern horizon, a terrifying reminder of the destruction that was coming their way. The men Colonel Ludington needed to gather were not anonymous soldiers. They were his neighbors, his friends. The network he commanded was built on personal trust and obligation. And with time of the essence and no one else available to go, the scene was set for an extraordinary act, an act born of necessity, driven by loyalty, and carried out by a young woman whose entire life had, in a sense, been an unwitting preparation for this very moment. This is more than just the setup for an adventure story. It is a window into a time when history was being made not just by kings and generals, but by ordinary people called upon to do extraordinary things. And the question remains, on that dark and stormy night in 1777, was one of those people a 16-year-old girl named Sybil Ludington? Let's picture the scene inside the Ludington household. It's late, well past the hour that a respectable family would be abed. The younger children are likely asleep, blissfully unaware of the unfolding crisis. But in the main room, the air crackles with urgency. The messenger's words hang in the air, each one a hammer blow. Tryon, 2,000 men, Danbury is burning. For Colonel Ludington, this is the moment every militia commander fears. The enemy is on his doorstep, and his forces, the only line of defense, are scattered to the four winds. His men were not professional soldiers billeted in a barracks, ready to be summoned by a single bugle call. They were farmers, blacksmiths, tanners, and millers. They were asleep in their own beds, in homesteads and farmhouses spread across a territory of nearly 200 square miles of rugged, unforgiving terrain. There were no telephones, no telegraphs. The only way to reach them was by horse, one man at a time, riding through the dark. The colonel's dilemma was excruciating. The messenger who brought the news was on the verge of collapse, his horse likely lamed or exhausted. His own men who served as regular couriers were already out on other missions, or were among those who needed to be summoned themselves. Could he go? As the commander, his instinct might have been to leap into the saddle himself, but his duty was here, at the command post. He was the rally point. He needed to be there to organize the men as they arrived, to give them orders, to prepare them for the march. If he were to ride off into the night, his men would arrive to chaos and confusion. He was the mind of the operation, and had to stay to command it. He was trapped by his own responsibility. It is in this moment of desperate gridlock that the legend turns to Sybil. At 16, she was no longer a child, but not yet a woman in the eyes of the world. She had spent her life absorbing the realities of this conflict, listening to the hushed conversations of her father and his men. She understood the stakes, and according to the story passed down through her family, she stepped forward from the shadows. We can only imagine the conversation that followed. It was likely not a grand, theatrical speech. It would have been quiet, tense. Sybil, seeing her father's anguish and understanding the critical need, would have simply said, "I'll go." Think of the weight of that offer. Colonel Ludington must have looked at his firstborn child, his daughter, and felt a surge of both pride and terror. To send her out into that night, it was unthinkable. The roads were treacherous enough in broad daylight. At night, in a driving rainstorm, they were a death trap of sucking mud, unseen gullies, and fallen branches. And that was just the natural dangers. The neutral ground was infested with skinners and cowboys, ruthless men who would think nothing of robbing, harming, or even killing a lone traveler. To send his daughter into that cauldron of danger was a father's worst nightmare. But Sybil would have been insistent. She knew the land better than anyone. She had ridden these paths her entire life. She knew where people lived. She knew the shortcuts. She knew the temperament of the horses in the stable. She was not a stranger to this world. She was a product of it. Her voice, likely steady and firm, would have cut through his protests. She wasn't asking for permission as a child. She was volunteering as a capable participant in the cause. She was a Ludington, and the Ludingtons did not shirk their duty. In the end, faced with an impossible choice, Colonel Ludington made the only one he could. He agreed. His daughter would become the messenger. The preparation would have been swift, with no time for lengthy goodbyes. Sybil would have pulled on her warmest cloak, a meager defense against the biting wind and rain. She went to the stable and chose her own horse, a strong, spirited animal the family called Star. She would have known Star's every mood, his strength, his endurance. They had a bond of trust, and tonight her life would depend on it. Perhaps her mother, Abigail, met her at the door with a final, fearful embrace and a whispered prayer. Then, with a quick nod to her father, Sybil swung herself into the saddle. She carried with her only a long stick, not as a weapon, but to rap on the heavy wooden doors of the farmhouses, and if necessary, to fend off any overly aggressive dogs. Her real weapon was her knowledge of the land and the urgency of her message. As Star's hooves clattered on the wet ground, leaving the small circle of light from her family's home, she was instantly swallowed by a profound inky blackness. The first leg of her journey, according to historical reconstructions of her route, took her south. She rode toward the small hamlet of Carmel, then looped west towards Mahopac. This was not a ride down a single straight road. It was a sprawling, circuitous route designed to reach the maximum number of homesteads in the shortest possible time. At each house, the process would have been the same. She would rein Star in, her heart pounding, and hammer on the door with her stick. Imagine the scene from the perspective of the militiamen. You are jolted from sleep not by a rooster, but by a frantic pounding on your door. You grab your musket, fearing a loyalist raid. You crack the door open to see not a band of marauders, but a lone figure on horseback, a young woman soaked to the bone, her voice strained but clear. The British are burning Danbury. Muster at Ludington's at first light. The shock, the disbelief, quickly followed by the cold rush of adrenaline. You pull on your boots, grab your powder horn, kiss your sleeping family goodbye, and step out into the same storm she is riding through. At every stop, she was a catalyst, a spark that ignited a fire of resistance. With each house she roused, she rode back into the consuming darkness. The physical toll would have been immense. The rain, driven by the wind, would have felt like needles against her skin, seeping through her cloak until she was chilled to the bone. The constant motion of the horse, the strain of keeping her seat on slippery, muddy paths, would have made every muscle ache. Her hands, gripping the wet reins, would have been numb with cold. But the psychological strain was likely even worse. Every shadow could conceal a threat. The snap of a twig could be a footstep. The rustle of leaves could be a highwayman lying in wait. She was utterly alone, an isolated point of light and purpose in a vast hostile wilderness. What thoughts went through her mind? Did she think of her father's trust in her? Did she worry about her younger siblings, safe and warm in their beds? Did fear ever threaten to overwhelm her? Of course it must have. She was 16, but the legend tells us that she pushed the fear down, fueled by the urgency of her mission. She was not just riding for her father. She was riding for her neighbors, for her community, for the very idea of the free country they were all fighting for. Her ride was a testament to the power of a single individual to make a difference, to the idea that history is not just shaped by armies, but by the courage in a single human heart. From Mahopac, her route allegedly took her north, through Kent Cliffs and Farmers Mills, a landscape of steep hills and dense forests. This would have been the most arduous part of the journey. The paths would have been narrower, the terrain more challenging for a tired horse. Starr would have been straining, his breath coming in ragged bursts. Sybil would have had to guide him with skill and instinct, feeling her way through the darkness, relying on her memory of every twist and turn. It was during these lonely middle hours of the night that her resolve would have been tested most severely. Exhaustion is a powerful enemy. It dulls the senses, slows the mind, and whispers words of defeat. It would have been so easy to stop, to seek shelter in a barn and wait for daylight. But she didn't. She kept going, house after house, a solitary phantom in the storm. One story, perhaps an embellishment, but a powerful one nonetheless, tells of an encounter with a highwayman. The man allegedly stepped from the woods, intent on robbing the lone rider, but Sybil, using her wits and her stick, spurred Starr on and managed to escape, her determination only hardened by the encounter. Whether true or not, the story highlights the very real danger she faced. She was not on a protected route. She was a vulnerable target in a lawless land. Finally, her route turned back east, toward her home in Fredericksburg. She had ridden in a great looping circle through the heart of her father's regimental district. The storm was likely beginning to subside, and the first faint gray hint of dawn would have been appearing on the eastern horizon, the same horizon that hours earlier had glowed with the fires of Danbury. As she approached her home, a new sound would have reached her ears over the dripping of the rain, the sound of men's voices, the clink of muskets, the stamping of horses. The sight that greeted her must have been one of profound relief and triumph. Her ride had been a success. The yard was filled with men, tired but resolute, answering her call. Her father was there, directing them, forming them into companies. She had done it. She had delivered the warning. The militia was mustering. She would have slid from Starr's back, her body screaming with exhaustion, every joint and muscle protesting. She probably collapsed into her father's arms, the long night's tension finally releasing in a flood of relief. She had ridden nearly 40 miles. She had been in the saddle for most of the night, through darkness, storm, and constant danger, and she had succeeded. The immediate aftermath for Sybil was likely a deep, dreamless sleep of utter exhaustion. Her part in the drama was over, but for the men she had summoned, their part was just beginning. Numbering around 400, Colonel Ludington's militia immediately began the march toward Connecticut. They were too late to save Danbury, which had been thoroughly sacked and burned by Tryon's forces. But they were not too late to make the British pay a price. They joined up with other continental and militia forces under the command of generals like Benedict Arnold, before his treason, and David Wooster. On April 27th, they engaged the retreating British column near Ridgefield, Connecticut. In a fierce running battle, the American militia, including Ludington's men, relentlessly harassed the British rear guard. They fought from behind stone walls and trees, making the British withdrawal a bloody and costly affair. While technically a British victory in that they accomplished their primary objective, the raid on Danbury came at a high cost and demonstrated the fierce resilience of the American militia. They had proven that they could mobilize quickly and fight effectively, even when caught by surprise. And that swift mobilization, that crucial response, was made possible by the actions of a 16-year-old girl. While the generals received the credit and the battle was recorded in the official histories, Sybil's contribution, the critical first step in the chain of events, was performed in the dark and, for a long time, went unrecorded. She had been the voice in the night, the anonymous alarm, the invisible force that set the counterattack in motion. Her ride was over, but the questions surrounding her legacy were just beginning to form. The men summoned by the midnight cry fought with the ferocity of those defending their own soil. The Battle of Ridgefield and the subsequent skirmishes during the British withdrawal were a bloody affair. The Americans, though unable to stop the retreat, inflicted significant casualties and proved a vital point. An attack on the American heartland would not go unpunished. In the official reports that followed, generals were praised, officers were cited for their bravery, and the militia as a whole was commended for its spirited response. The event was recorded, analyzed, and entered into the annals of the Revolutionary War. But what of the catalyst? What of the 16-year-old girl who, according to legend, made that response possible? Did she receive a commendation from General Washington? Was her name mentioned in the dispatches? Was she celebrated in the local gazettes as the heroine of Fredericksburg? The answer, in a word, is no. In the immediate aftermath of the raid, and for many, many years to come, the historical record concerning Sybil Ludington's ride is one of profound and deafening silence. And it is this silence that forms the heart of the mystery, the central controversy that transforms her story from a simple tale of heroism into a complex and fascinating historical puzzle. For a historian, a good story is not enough. The foundation of history is evidence, primary sources, contemporary accounts, artifacts that provide a tangible link to the past. A primary source is a piece of evidence created by someone who participated in or witnessed an event. This could be a letter, a diary entry, an official military report, a newspaper article from the time, a deposition, or even a simple entry in a town ledger. These are the building blocks historians use to construct a verifiable narrative. When we look for the primary sources to support the story of Sybil Ludington's ride, we find a void, a complete and total absence. There are no known letters from her father, Colonel Ludington, mentioning his daughter's heroic act. There are no entries in the diaries of other officers or soldiers from the 7th Dutchess County Militia describing how they were roused from their beds by a teenage girl. The official military records of the engagement, while they exist, make no mention of the specific method used to muster the troops on the night of April 26th. The local newspapers of the time, such as the New York Packet and the American Advertiser or the Connecticut Journal, reported on the Danbury raid and the subsequent battle, but contain not a single word about a midnight ride by a colonel's daughter. To understand how unusual this is, we must once again compare her story to that of Paul Revere. Paul Revere's ride in April 1775 is cemented in history, not just because of a famous poem, but because it is supported by a wealth of contemporary evidence. Revere himself wrote 2 separate accounts of his journey. He gave a deposition to the Massachusetts Provincial Congress in 1775, providing a detailed sworn testimony of his actions. His name appears in the records and correspondence of his fellow patriots. We know who sent him, the route he took, the people he met, and the outcome of his mission, all from documents written within days or weeks of the event. For Sybil Ludington, we have nothing comparable. How could an event of this magnitude, a 40-mile ride that successfully mustered 400 men and sent them into a significant military engagement, vanish so completely from the record? This is the question that has bedeviled historians for over a century and has led to a deep and enduring debate. The historical community is sharply divided into 2 main camps. On one side are the skeptics. They look at the utter lack of contemporary evidence and conclude that the ride, as it has been told, almost certainly did not happen. Their argument is a powerful one based on the fundamental principles of historical verification. They argue that it is simply not plausible that an event so dramatic and consequential would leave no trace in the records of the time. The skeptics suggest several alternative possibilities. Perhaps Sybil did ride that night, but on a much smaller scale, maybe just to a few nearby farms to alert close neighbors. This smaller, more personal mission could then have been embellished over the years, growing in scale and scope with each retelling, until it became the grand 40-mile epic we know today. Another possibility they raise is that the story is a complete fabrication, a piece of family folklore created decades later to honor an ancestor and establish a local hero. They point out that stories like this were common in the 19th century, a period of intense national pride and romanticism, when Americans were eager for heroes, especially ones that could be seen as homegrown counterparts to the legendary figures of Europe. On the other side of the debate are those who argue that an absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence. This camp suggests that we must look at the context of the time and consider why the ride might have gone unrecorded. Their primary argument centers on the pervasive gender bias of the 18th century. In the world of 1777, the public sphere, the world of politics, war, and official records, was almost exclusively male. A woman's contribution, no matter how vital, was often seen as private, domestic, or simply an extension of her husband's or father's will. A formal military report would detail which officers mustered which companies of men. It would be highly unlikely for the male author of such a report to credit a 16-year-old girl with being the primary agent of that muster. Her ride, if it happened, may have been seen simply as Colonel Ludington sending out the alarm, with the specific person who carried the message being deemed an irrelevant detail. She was his daughter, acting under his implied command. In the eyes of the 18th century military establishment, her actions were his actions. This side also points to the nature of the region. This was not Boston or Philadelphia. This was a rugged rural frontier. Record-keeping was often sporadic, and the focus was on survival and immediate action, not on documenting every detail for posterity. It is conceivable that, in the chaos of the moment, the priority was mustering for battle, not writing down how it was accomplished. The story of Sybil's ride, then, survived not in official documents, but in the one place where women's stories were often preserved, oral tradition. The story was first brought to public attention in 1880 in a book about New York City history by a local historian named Martha Lamb. She claimed to have heard it from older residents, but the most detailed account came later in a 1907 book titled The Real Granddaughter of a Patriot of the Revolution, written by Sybil's great-grandnephew, Willis Fletcher Johnson. He stated that the story was a cherished piece of Ludington family lore, passed down from those who were there. So the dilemma is this: do we trust the official documented record, which is silent? Or do we trust the unofficial oral tradition of a family, which tells a powerful and compelling story? The truth likely lies somewhere in the murky space between the two. But let us for a moment set aside the debate over the ride and ask another question. What happened to the girl at the center of the story? If Sybil Ludington was a hero, her life after her famous ride showed no sign of it. She did not marry a wealthy general or become a celebrated figure in the new republic. Her life, like the evidence for her ride, was one of quiet obscurity, marked by the common struggles of her time. In 1784, at the age of 23, Sybil married a man named Edmund Ogden. He had also served in the Revolution, and together they settled in Catskill, New York. They had one son, whom they named Henry. For a time, life was likely one of modest stability. Edmund practiced law, and Sybil took on the role of a wife and mother, the traditional path for women of her era. Did she tell her son stories of her midnight ride? Did her husband boast of his wife's youthful bravery? We don't know. There are no letters from Sybil that have survived. Her inner thoughts, her reflections on her own life, and the part she may have played in history are lost to us. Her life took a more difficult turn in the later years. The family faced financial struggles, a common fate for many who had sacrificed for the Revolution. They moved several times, seeking better opportunities. In 1799, Edmund Ogden died, leaving Sybil a widow at the age of just 38, with a young son to raise on her own. The following decades would be a struggle for survival. Perhaps the most poignant and ironic chapter of her life comes from a government document. After her husband's death, and later in her own old age, Sybil attempted to apply for his military pension, a benefit afforded to the veterans of the Revolution and their surviving spouses. The process was arduous, requiring extensive proof of service. For reasons that remain unclear, perhaps lost paperwork, perhaps bureaucratic indifference, her application was rejected. Think about that for a moment. Sybil Ludington, the woman celebrated today as a heroine who rode to save her country, was denied a pension by that very same country. It is a bitter testament to her anonymity. If she had truly been a recognized figure, a female Paul Revere, her name alone might have carried weight. But she was just another poor widow, unable to navigate the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the government. Her own potential contribution, her ride, carried no official weight and was likely never even mentioned. Sybil spent her final years living with her son and his family in Unadilla, New York. She died on February 26, 1839, at the age of 77. She had lived to see the fledgling nation she may have helped save grow into a robust and expanding republic. She saw the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, the election of Andrew Jackson, and the beginnings of the westward expansion. She was a bridge between the revolutionary generation and a new America. And where was this hero laid to rest? She was buried next to her father, the respected Colonel Henry Ludington, in the Patterson Presbyterian Cemetery in Putnam County, not far from the very roads she had once ridden. But for nearly a century, her grave remained unmarked. There was no stone, no inscription, no acknowledgement of the woman who lay beneath. She had ridden out of the darkness and, in death, had returned to it. It was the final silent act in a life of obscurity, a potent symbol of a nation's forgotten memory. For nearly 100 years after her death in 1839, Sybil Ludington Ogden lay here in the Patterson Presbyterian Cemetery in an unmarked grave. Her story, if it was told at all, was a faint whisper, a piece of private family lore shared by an ever-dwindling number of descendants. She had ridden out of the darkness of a revolutionary night only to be consumed by the quiet darkness of historical oblivion. A nation forged in part by the sacrifices of people like her had, it seemed, completely forgotten her name. But history has a strange way of resurrecting its ghosts. Stories that lie dormant for generations can be reawakened by a single curious historian, a new social movement, or a cultural yearning for heroes that speak to a new age. The story of Sybil Ludington's ride was not destined to remain buried forever. Its journey back into the light is in many ways as remarkable as the ride itself. It is a story of rediscovery, of romanticism, and of the deliberate creation of a legend. The long silence began to break in the latter half of the 19th century. America was changing. The Civil War had torn the nation apart and stitched it back together, creating a renewed and often nostalgic interest in its founding era. This was the period of the colonial revival, a cultural movement that romanticized the Revolutionary period, celebrating its architecture, its ideals, and, above all, its heroes. At the same time, another revolution was brewing, the movement for women's suffrage. Women were beginning to demand a place in the public sphere, and part of that demand involved reclaiming their place in history, searching for foremothers whose stories of strength and agency had been ignored. It was in this fertile cultural soil that the seed of Sybil's story began to sprout. The first known public mention appeared in 1880 in historian Martha Lamb's massive History of the City of New York. Tucked away in a footnote, Lamb briefly recounts the story of the fearless ride, attributing it to local traditions. It was a minor mention, easily overlooked, but it was a start. The story was no longer just a private memory. It had entered the public record, however modestly. The real architect of the Ludington legend, however, was a man with a personal connection to the story, Willis Fletcher Johnson, Sybil's great-grandnephew. In 1907, he published a biography of his own ancestor, and in a chapter dedicated to Sybil's side of the family, he laid out the most detailed and dramatic account of the ride that had yet been seen. Drawing on what he insisted were long-cherished family traditions and stories passed down directly from his grandmother, he painted a vivid picture of the storm-tossed night, the heroic young girl, and the successful mustering of the militia. Johnson's writing was of its time, patriotic, romantic, and unabashedly celebratory. He presented the story not as a contested piece of folklore, but as an established, if overlooked, historical fact. His account became the foundational text, the primary source from which nearly all future retellings would draw. But a story in a book is one thing. To truly cement a legend in the public consciousness, it needs to be written upon the landscape itself. It needs to become a part of the physical world. This next crucial step would be taken by one of the most powerful forces in American historical preservation, the Daughters of the American Revolution, or DAR. Founded in 1890, the DAR was dedicated to preserving the memory of the men and women who fought for American independence. In the early 20th century, local chapters of the DAR began a nationwide project to mark historical sites. For the Enoch Crosby chapter in Putnam County, New York, the story of their local heroine, Sybil Ludington, was a perfect cause to champion. Starting in 1912, the DAR began placing a series of stone markers along the supposed 40-mile route of Sybil's ride. Each marker placed at a key point along the route, in Carmel, in Mahopac, in Kent, acted as a historical anchor. For locals and tourists driving through the scenic countryside, these stones transformed a local legend into a tangible journey. You could now literally follow in Sybil's footsteps, or rather, her hoofprints. The plaques did not say, according to legend, or family tradition holds. They stated with the authority of bronze and stone. Sybil Ludington rode this way. The act of marking the route was an act of validation. It made the story real, permanent, and official in the eyes of the public. The efforts of the DAR culminated in a powerful symbolic act in the 1930s. They located Sybil's long-neglected grave in Paterson. For nearly a century, she had lain in anonymity. The Enoch Crosby chapter raised the funds and, in 1935, placed a proper headstone on her grave. It was a moment of profound resurrection. The stone, carved with her name, dates, and a simple acknowledgement of her patriotic service, finally gave her the recognition in death that she had been denied in life. The forgotten girl was forgotten no more. By the mid-20th century, Sybil's story was well established as a piece of beloved local history, but she was not yet a national figure. The event that would catapult her into the American pantheon of heroes came in 1961. To commemorate the ride, a committee of local citizens commissioned a statue, and the sculptor they chose was no ordinary artist. She was Anna Hyatt Huntington, one of the most celebrated and prolific female sculptors of the 20th century. Huntington, then in her 80s, was renowned for her powerful and realistic equestrian statues. The subject of a fearless girl on horseback resonated deeply with her. She threw herself into the project, creating a dynamic, larger-than-life bronze statue that perfectly captured the drama of the legend. Unveiled on the shore of Lake Gleneda in Carmel, New York, Huntington's statue is a masterpiece of storytelling. It depicts Sybil not as a delicate maiden, but as a figure of immense strength and determination. She is leaning forward, one hand on the reins, the other gripping the stick she used to bang on doors. Her hair and cloak are flying behind her, conveying a sense of incredible speed and urgency. The horse, Star, is a powerful beast, his muscles taut, his head thrown back as he gallops through the night. The statue is not a passive portrait. It is an action scene frozen in bronze. It is pure energy, courage, and motion. For the first time, America had a definitive image of its forgotten heroine. The statue gave Sybil a face, a form, and a powerful physical presence. It became a site of pilgrimage, a place where the story was not just told, but seen and felt. It cemented her identity as the female Paul Revere in a way no book or marker ever could. The final step in her journey from obscurity to icon status came in 1975 as America geared up for its bicentennial celebration. The United States Postal Service issued a series of stamps under the theme Contributors to the Cause, honoring lesser-known figures of the Revolution. And there, alongside a Haym Salomon and a Salem Poor, was Sybil Ludington. The 8-cent stamp featuring a stylized image of Sybil on her horse against a moonlit sky was a definitive statement of national recognition. A postage stamp is a piece of official government iconography. It travels to every corner of the country, carrying with it a small piece of the nation's story. By placing her image on a stamp, the U.S. government was, in effect, endorsing her story, elevating it from local folklore to a chapter in the national narrative. Millions of Americans who had never heard her name now saw her honored alongside the most famous figures in their history. The debate among academic historians about the lack of evidence seemed a minor point compared to this overwhelming public and official embrace. Why? Why did this particular story, with its shaky historical foundations, capture the American imagination so completely? The answer lies in what Sybil came to represent. She was more than just a girl on a horse. She was a powerful and adaptable symbol. First and foremost, she became a feminist icon. In a historical landscape dominated by the Founding Fathers, Sybil provided a desperately needed founding daughter. Her story was a powerful counter-narrative, proving that women were not just passive bystanders in the Revolution, but active, courageous participants. Her youth and gender made her bravery seem even more extraordinary. For generations of schoolgirls, she was an accessible and inspiring role model, a hero who looked like them. Her story also resonated as a tale of youthful heroism. At a time when teenagers are often underestimated, the story of a 16-year-old entrusted with a mission of such importance is incredibly empowering. It speaks to the potential that lies within young people to rise to extraordinary challenges. Furthermore, there is a deep appeal in the narrative of the underdog, the forgotten hero finally getting their due. Her long obscurity made her eventual celebration feel like the righting of a historical wrong. We root for her not just because of what she did, but because of the long silence that followed. Celebrating Sybil is, in a way, an act of historical justice. Ultimately, Sybil's story filled a cultural need. Nations are built on myths and legends as much as on documented facts. Paul Revere's ride, as immortalized in Longfellow's poem, is itself a highly romanticized and historically simplified version of events. America needed a female counterpart, a story of equal daring and patriotism. Whether her ride happened exactly as the legend says is, for many, less important than the truth the story represents. That courage is not limited by age or gender, and that the fate of a nation can sometimes rest on the actions of a single, determined individual. The legend of Sybil Ludington may be a historian's puzzle, but it is a nation's treasure. So, where does this leave us in the saga of Sybil Ludington? We are left with a fascinating duality, a historical paradox. On one hand, we have the Sybil of the archives, a ghost, a whisper, a figure whose most celebrated act is surrounded by a profound and frustrating silence. On the other hand, we have the Sybil of stone and stamp, a cultural giant, a celebrated heroine whose story is etched into the American landscape and its national consciousness. Which one is real? The historian, bound by the rigorous demands of evidence, must lean toward the ghost. The public, moved by the power of a great story and the need for inspiring heroes, embraces the giant. To truly understand Sybil Ludington, we must accept that both of these figures exist, and that her true significance lies in the space between them. Her legacy is not a simple story of a midnight ride. It is a far more complex and important story about how we remember, what we choose to celebrate, and who gets to be a hero. If we were to judge Sybil Ludington solely on the verifiable facts of her life, her legacy would be a modest one, a daughter of a patriot colonel who lived through the Revolution, married, raised a son, and died in obscurity. But her legend has a legacy that is immense and continues to grow. It has branched out in several powerful directions, each fulfilling a deep-seated cultural need. Her most powerful legacy is undoubtedly as a feminist icon, a founding daughter. History, as it has traditionally been written, is a parade of great men, generals, presidents, philosophers, and kings. Women, if they appear at all, are often relegated to the roles of wives, mothers, or queens. The American Revolution is no exception. We learn about the founding fathers, but rarely the founding mothers. Sibyl's story shatters that mold. It presents a young woman as the central actor in a dramatic and pivotal event. She is not supporting a man, she is the hero. She is proactive, courageous, and physically daring. This makes her an incredibly important figure for anyone seeking to create a more inclusive and accurate picture of the past, one where women's contributions are not just acknowledged, but celebrated. Her story provides a powerful answer to the question, where were the women during the Revolution? The answer is, they were right there, sometimes even leading the charge. Beyond gender, her story is a potent celebration of youthful courage. The fact that she was only 16 makes her alleged feat all the more remarkable. It challenges our preconceived notions about the capabilities of teenagers. Her story tells us that heroism is not the exclusive domain of seasoned adults. It teaches that passion, conviction, and a deep sense of duty can empower a young person to achieve incredible things. In an age where young people are constantly striving to find their voice and make their mark on the world, Sybil serves as a timeless role model. She is a symbol of youthful potential unleashed. Perhaps most profoundly, Sybil has become a symbol for the countless unsung heroes of history. For every Paul Revere whose name is remembered, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of other messengers, spies, and ordinary citizens who risked their lives for the cause of independence, but whose names are lost to time. Most of these people were not wealthy landowners or influential politicians. They were farmers, blacksmiths, housewives, and free and enslaved African Americans, whose individual acts of bravery were the threads that wove the tapestry of victory. Because Sybil's own story was almost lost, she has, paradoxically, become the patron saint of the anonymous patriot. In celebrating her, we are also honoring all the others whose rides were never recorded and whose names we will never know. She gives a face to the faceless. To truly understand Sybil's place in American culture, we must look one last time at her famous male counterpart. We hold Sybil's story up to a harsh light of scrutiny because it lacks contemporary evidence. But how much of what we know about Paul Revere is actually true? The popular image of Paul Revere, the lone rider, galloping heroically through the night, shouting, "The British are coming," from town to town, is itself a myth. That version of the story comes almost entirely from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's 1861 poem, Paul Revere's Ride. The historical reality was different. Revere was one of several riders that night. Another, William Dawes, rode a longer route. Revere never shouted, "The British are coming." That would have been nonsensical, as most colonists still considered themselves British. His warning was more discreet. The regulars are coming out. And most importantly, Paul Revere never finished his ride to Concord. He was captured by a British patrol. His horse was confiscated, and he was eventually released to walk back to Lexington. Longfellow, writing on the eve of the Civil War, was not trying to be a historian. He was a poet, crafting a national myth to inspire a sense of unity and patriotic courage. He simplified the story, elevated a single man to legendary status, and created a powerful piece of national folklore. And we, as a culture, have embraced Longfellow's poem far more than we have embraced the messy historical facts. This puts the controversy surrounding Sybil Ludington in a new perspective. Both stories, as they exist in the popular imagination, are legends. Both are romanticized versions of possible events. Both serve a powerful cultural purpose. Yet Revere's legend is often accepted as history, while Sybil's is frequently dismissed as just a myth because it lacks the underlying documentary proof that Revere's ride had. It begs the question, do we hold our heroines to a higher standard of proof than our heroes? Is the silence in the archives for Sybil seen as more damning than the poetic license taken with Revere? The comparison forces us to confront the subtle biases that can shape which stories we choose to sanctify and which we choose to question. In the end, the search for the real Sybil Ludington may never be resolved. No long-lost diary is likely to surface. No forgotten military dispatch will suddenly appear to confirm her ride beyond all doubt. We will likely be left forever with the historian's frustrating lack of proof and the storyteller's powerful narrative. But perhaps her true value lies not in the certainty of the answer, but in the power of the search itself. The story of Sybil Ludington, whether absolute fact or embellished folklore, accomplishes something essential. It forces us to look into the blank spaces of our history. It compels us to ask difficult questions about who writes the records and whose stories get left out. It challenges us to remember that the absence of a voice in the official archives does not mean that the person had nothing to say. Her legend serves as a monument, not just to one girl on one night, but to the forgotten contributions of countless women who were pivotal to the founding of a nation. It is a powerful and necessary myth that speaks to a larger truth, a truth that is more important than the specific details of a 40-mile ride. That truth is that heroism is not defined by gender, that courage knows no age, and that the history of any great struggle is incomplete until all of its voices are heard. So, did Sybil Ludington ride? Perhaps the best answer is that she rides still. She rides through the American imagination as a symbol of defiance. She rides as an inspiration to young people. She rides as a reminder that the most important stories are often the ones we have to fight to remember. And that is a legacy more enduring than bronze and more valuable than any historical document.